Thank you, David. Like the others, actually, I'm the last one up. Before the big conversation, but like everyone before me, I really do want to thank our organizers. First, Charlotte, and then followed, of course, by Bruce and the whole team. They've done a fantastic job, made us feel all very comfortable here. This is my first time in Maine or Camden, and so it's really been fun. It's also been a huge honor to be a part of this group of presenters. The organizers chose wisely, at least up until this point. And it's been a huge treat for me, really, sitting in the front row all of yesterday and the night before to hear from all of them. And so I'm really looking forward to doing my part in this conversation. Now, because this is a public event and we're recording, I do want to take just 1 minute to say something about my employer, which David mentioned, the U.S. Institute of Peace. I've done a bit of an unscientific survey, that is, I've talked to a couple of you, and I found that you had never heard of the U.S. Institute of Peace. So I thought I'd try to fix that, at least for this room. The U.S. Institute of Peace is funded by you, by the American taxpayer. So I think it's important that you know where at least a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of your tax dollars is going. We're a bipartisan institution. We were founded in 1984 during the Reagan administration. Our headquarters is a beautiful building just across the street from the State Department in Washington, D.C. We're bipartisan, strictly. We have a board of directors, half Republican, half Democratic. We routinely work with and alongside U.S. policymakers across the interagency, that is State Department, Defense Department, and so on. We also have a bunch of field offices all around the world, at least 16 and counting. And our teams work on, we describe it, pressing national security issues, including strategic rivalry, violent extremism, global shocks like climate change, pandemics, and how they affect peace and security. We have a fantastic, and it's over the past couple of years, a growing team that works on Asia, including South Asia. And so I invite you to check out our website, usip.org, to learn more, so you will now know what the U.S. Institute of Peace is. Now, having said all of that, I am not speaking for USIP. I am speaking only for myself. I am definitely not speaking for the U.S. government or the State Department or anyone like that. We just happen to be across the street from them. Okay, so let's get back to India. At this conference, a lot of very smart, sophisticated things have been said about what's happening, but mainly, until Tanvi, mainly, and with exception maybe of Ashley, what's happening inside of India. We've really focused there. We've talked about India's global aspirations. We've talked about India's relations with its neighbors. But a lot less has been said about US policy. And so I think that's where I come in. We've touched a few hot button issues, but I want to try to connect the dots a bit more and see this question or the challenge through this peculiar and in some ways very narrowing lens of US policy. Now, it's especially, for me at least, interesting time to be thinking about India. This past year was an unbelievably active one for US policymakers. And I say that having been in Washington and working on related issues at least for about 20 years now. There were diplomatic high points, including, as is mentioned, Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington in June for a state visit, G20 trip by President Biden to New Delhi. And so there's been a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm about this relationship. And I want to talk about three basic things now. First, and I think this will probably be the easiest one, why India will inevitably be a major factor in US foreign policy going forward. Second, how US policy and strategy have already shifted to take into account India's growing global role. And third, I want to identify at least a handful of caveats or challenges that I see for US policymakers in taking this relationship forward. So, inevitable India, first point. You've already heard a lot about the numbers. We could run the numbers again, but I won't. But the sheer scale of India is impressive. And I think by now you're probably convinced of a number of different things, but I don't need to tell you that India is very, very big. Now, from a US perspective, just the simple fact that 1 in 6 human beings thereabouts, live in India. Whatever happens in India matters a great deal to us. It's inescapable. So any big global issue that you can think of, human security, economic growth and development, climate change, public health, none of those can be addressed if you don't think about what's actually happening inside of India. So how India manages itself is in a sense relevant to US national interests and foreign policy. But it's not just India's population that matters. India has a large and growing economy. We've talked a lot about that as well. But that, of course, makes India really interesting to US policymakers of all sorts, as well, of course, as to US business. And India's military capabilities also, as I think Tanvi and Ashley pointed to this as well, place it in the upper tier of world powers. India is a nuclear power. Nuclear tests, well, first a peaceful nuclear explosion in '74, nuclear tests in '98, now an arsenal of something over 160 warheads. So this is a considerable part of India's military capability. David mentioned India's Ministry of Defense as being, the world's largest employer. In addition to the 1.5 or odd million active duty troops, you've got about a million paramilitaries as well. So this is an enormous capability. The world's third highest military budget after the US and China, and in recent years, a major, usually top 3 arms purchaser from around the world. And then finally, as I think Tanvi did a great job pointing out, India's really beefed up and expanded its diplomatic activity. So in addition to the G20 summit, India and Prime Minister Modi in particular have projected themselves as a world leader or a Vishwaguru on the world stage, and have sought other opportunities to project India's leadership and power, including by seeking a UN Security Council seat, as Ambassador Rao pointed out a couple of nights ago. And India plays a really active and interesting role in a variety of the new organizations that Tanvi just mentioned. Things like the BRICS or the SCO, or minilaterals like the Quad or the I2U2 and so on. So I think by now, it's pretty easy to be convinced that India will inevitably matter. So let's get to the second point. India already plays an important role in US strategy. So even this accounting of how India is important doesn't do justice to the real sea change that's taken place in my professional lifetime on issues related to India, at least in Washington. So when I came to DC in 2003, at the State Department at the time, India was having trouble distancing itself from Pakistan in the minds of US policymakers. Ashley mentioned this issue of India-Pakistan hyphenated. We were working at the time to dehyphenate the two, to separate them out, to treat India as an issue, as a concern, as a partner in and of itself. And this took some work, because most US perspectives were really focused and fixated on that India-Pakistan dynamic. And it also met with some skepticism, because for a number of US policymakers, including very senior ones, India was then, and they believed would always be, a country with a lot of potential, right? It was something that we were always looking forward to, but never had actually gotten to. And remember, this was in just a few years after 9/11, so a lot of Washington's attention was on the global war on terrorism, on the hunt for bin Laden, on Pakistan, on Afghanistan. Today, fast forward, 20 years later or thereabouts, India is now perceived by top US policymakers as a linchpin of Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy, the core dynamic and of what we're trying to do, the vision of what we're trying to do in Asia, or what the administration's trying to do. Often, I think the at least unspoken aim of this strategy is to shore up US influence in the Indo-Pacific and to defend US interests from the threat posed by a rising China. So geopolitical competition has really replaced this global war on terrorism over those 20 years. And India is or possibly the pivotal state in Asia, with a single-handed almost capacity to alter the geopolitical balance between the United States and China. So top administration officials now think that getting India right is vital, possibly even an existential issue for US policy. So We cannot afford, they believe, to miss out on kind of attracting India, in a sense, to our side, or at least not to China's side, in that geopolitical balance. I've already talked about India's scale, but in this competition, it's not just a matter of people per se, but it's also think about people as aggregators of data, or intellectual, people who can come up with new intellectual property. In the future competition with China, a vast population has the potential to take on additional significance. India is also geopolitically located. I mean, we've made a point of seeing a number of maps. This is very important. Astride the Indian Ocean, this is a vital route for global trade, particularly for trade coming and going from China. And then we've talked to some extent, and I'll talk more about India's democratic credentials. Of course, this is a qualified issue, but India is unique, has been unique as the world's largest democracy, but it's also a non-Western and developing economy. And that convergence of these two features makes India a particularly attractive model, potentially, for what we now call the Global South. And that's something that the United States has found interesting and possibly worth supporting. So when you take all these things together, you can explain pretty easily why the Biden administration, like almost all of it, really all of its predecessors, going back as far certainly as the Bush administration, possibly the Clinton administration, all of them have energetically pursued this closer relationship with India. Okay, let's think about recent activity. What's been going on? I mentioned Modi's visit in June. Noteworthy in Washington because a bipartisan consensus of welcome to his visit. There's not much bipartisan consensus on anything in Washington right now, so this is noteworthy. And you had star-studded cast of characters from both sides of the aisle attending all of the events, including a luncheon at the State Department or the State Dinner. This is unusual. You've also seen an investment, a continued investment by Biden and his team in what's described as the Quad. That is India, Australia, Japan, and the United States working together in the Indo-Pacific. They really picked up where the Trump administration left off and pushed it forward with even more energy behind it. And they've secured just this past year, a number of really important and big defense deals, including plans to sell billions worth of armed drones, and to co-produce GE jet engines in the future. When you add to all of this, 2 decades worth now, as Tanvi was pointing out, of a variety of other defense deals, totaling since 2008 something in the order of $20 billion, you can see that there's a clear convergence in terms of defense industrial interests, as well as some strategic interests. And there's a desire in part, and I think others have mentioned this as well, doing this to try to wean India away from Russia as we do so. So, and economically as well, the last area, I'd say we've seen considerable progress in terms of our economic relationship with India. IPEF, a pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the Indo-Pacific economic framework, is an area where the United States has been eager to welcome India in, and India is partially in. And we've worked really closely on issues relating to high technology cooperation. Tanvi mentioned ISET. This is an initiative on critical and emerging technologies spearheaded by the 2 national security advisors, really trying to jumpstart those areas in our bilateral cooperation. Now, if we look forward, if we play this out, that's what we've seen so far, we can see that we're poised to do a great deal more in high technology areas. We're poised for more cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. We're poised for even more cooperation outside the Indo-Pacific, maybe even farther afield in Africa and elsewhere. And we're poised for a variety of other co-production and technological arrangements. So those are all the things that are kind of in the pipeline. Now let me get to the third part of my talk, the caveats or the challenges for US policy and strategy. Now broadly, I should begin this with a caveat to the caveat. Biden administration and its predecessors are basically right to seek a closer relationship with India. India is unique, as you've learned. It's an important partner for the United States. It is wise and smart for the United States to seek friends where we can, to make common cause with big and rising countries. We have real adversaries out in the world. We have real competitors. and we don't need to make more unnecessarily. But if we see India wrong, or we play India wrong, we would also make unnecessary mistakes. And the first potential challenge to the policy as we go forward is that it's conceivable that India won't develop fast enough to be a net exporter of security or stability, as we often describe it in Washington. That India will face the kinds of obstacles to growth that were outlined by previous speakers, and that if it fails to grow fast enough, India will be a much less able strategic partner for the United States going forward. Because the logic of our assumption of partnership with India and our investments in India and the relationship is that India actually can be this net security provider, at least in its region. And that is to mean or to say that India's military will be put to work in ways that basically complement US aims for the region, if not being the same. That those broader political and diplomatic efforts will basically, again, complement security and stability efforts, and India will not provoke new conflicts of its own. But if we have a weaker or not sufficiently strong India, it could be instead a net security liability. And Arvind and other economists have given us some reasons to worry. Will India actually this time escape from this past pattern of missed opportunities for economic growth? Will India just continue to struggle to meet the needs of its own people? And if that's the case, a poor India could become too weak, too internally divided to play a constructive role as the US strategic partner in Asia. And in fact, it could be even worse than that. India could occupy US attention and resources to help secure or stabilize India itself in ways that could be quite costly. That's my first concern. My second concern is that we may overestimate what India can do militarily to help us out. And Ashley Tellis has written a blockbuster article last year in Foreign Affairs magazine that made this point and caught the world a bit by surprise with a dramatic title, Bad Bet on India. But I think he's absolutely right. There have been some overly optimistic expectations about how the United States might help India might help the United States in a contingency, for instance, in a future war that we could imagine with China over Taiwan. And we need to remember that India's strategic interests are what it keeps closest to its heart, and its leaders have been very clear about this. They will avoid being sucked into other people's conflicts, and there are no qualms about that. So even if India is concerned about what China is doing on its border, that doesn't mean that India would join us in a war to defend Taiwan. India takes its strategic autonomy very, very seriously. And there's a deeper concern about military capabilities, and Tanvi was getting into this. For India to match or even begin to compete with China will require major new military investments that India seems unprepared or unable to muster the resources to do. And India, of course, has many other priorities, domestic priorities, has many other needs. So there's a bottom line here, which is India may lack both the will and the capability to be the kind of military partner that the United States hopes and in some quarters seems to expect. And that could be problematic going forward. A third and final caveat or concern, and this is my own. This is that we in Washington sometimes seem to misunderstand India's political culture. We may not actually share the kind of common worldview that we would hope. At the core of my argument is that the Biden administration, like many of its predecessors, tends to misunderstand the nature and the implications of what we describe as India's democracy. And that under the leadership of Narendra Modi, even some of what we have had before in terms of core features of democracy are eroding. And of course, you have all heard a great deal more about that, so I don't need to elaborate. But what is the implication of those developments for US policymakers? Even though the United States and India have been democracies for decades, that actually didn't even mean then, looking back, that we always saw eye to eye. We often disagreed. We disagreed throughout much of the Cold War. Both sides left many of our interactions irritated, sometimes much more than that, sometimes enraged. We really did not agree. And if you look at, say, UN voting patterns over this period, you'll see that the convergence of Indian and US voting patterns is somewhere in the order of 20 to 25%, as compared to the United States and, say, France, which is over 60%. And of course, we don't always agree with the French either. Now, it's not that one side is right or the other side is wrong. It's just we need to appreciate that there are differences between us. And the surprise over this, that there would be differences between two democracies, actually says a great deal about Americans and about American policymakers. That we have this expectation of like-mindedness because of the nature of our political system. Now, some of that expectation is actually backed up by international relations scholars. So it basically falls under the category of democratic peace theory. And if you have read any of that literature, you'll see that the argument actually isn't that democracies all agree with one another. It's that we just probably aren't going to go to war with one another when we disagree. And that's a much narrower argument. I'll come back to that in a little bit, but I think it's an important thing to keep in mind. But what if India's democracy is heading the wrong direction? What if we are heading toward an undemocratic India? If we boil down all of the arguments that we've heard so far, a few of them jump out as being particularly relevant to foreign policy. One is the problem of government interference in India's media, censorship, harassment of journalists, and so on. The second is the repression of civil society groups, and in particular, of groups who are dedicated to conducting research and analysis, scholarship on issues directly related to India's foreign policy. And then, of course, the concerns that we now have about the protection of minority rights and minorities in general in India. Now, to all of this, I would say there's also the sort of rising tide of illiberalism in India, which is not just a kind of a feature of democratic erosion, but a wider problem of social change. And this Hindu nationalist outlook the intention of Hindu nationalists is to inculcate their ideology embed it into Indian society. It's not just a matter of policy or law, it's a social shift undertaken through education, civic organizations, all intended to promote a particular worldview, to see India as a homeland principally for Hindus, and to contrast that identity with a more secular or pluralistic one. And in international relations, if you kind of pull this out, what does this mean? It means that Hindu nationalists see the world as a world of competing civilizations. Civilizations with their roots in history and culture and language and so on. And this is a very, very different worldview, a defining framework for how the world works as compared to, say, a liberal perspective, which stresses the primacy of the individual rights, and protections from the state, and which often sees the world as one defined by the competition between liberal democracies and illiberal or undemocratic states. It's also a distinct worldview from what we sometimes describe as a realist or realpolitik perspective, because that stresses a modern nation state as being the unit of the international order and does not differentiate between nation states on the basis of things like civilization or culture or worldview, but only on the basis of power. Okay, so what are the implications for all of this in terms of how it will affect India's behavior on the world stage? First, it will affect India's aims. What does India want to do in the world? I think it's fair to say that an illiberal, increasingly undemocratic India will seek something different from what a more liberal or democratic India would. It probably will be less of a supporter of liberal institutions, of liberal governance outside of world order institutions, like ones that promote the rule of law between states. So that's an important distinction and a troubling one, at least from a US perspective. Secondly, policy processes will change because India is less democratic. We have this sense that one of the reasons why, as I said before, democracies don't go to war with one another is because their processes, in terms of how they make decisions and how they explain them to their citizens, force a degree of accountability and transparency on their leaders. And that, in turn, makes them more trustworthy. and more accountable, more understandable outside of their own borders. And without all of that, without the sort of feedback loop between leaders and the people who are governed, their citizens, you have less of an opportunity to understand what's happening within the state, less of a chance to see and understand what's driving India, and then that makes it less accountable or trustworthy to us. The third point, an India that excludes or disempowers large parts of its population, its Muslim minority in particular, will have fewer participants, less diversity at the table, will probably be a less capable country writ large. And fourth, an increasingly illiberal India will be seen by its neighbors differently than a liberal democratic India. Potentially will be seen as a threatening or aggressive power, one with pretensions and aspirations that would ultimately harm them in ways that may not be the case if India were more liberal and democratic. So bottom line, this current political trajectory, more illiberal, more majoritarian, will make India potentially less like-minded, less trustworthy, less capable, and a less attractive partner for the United States. And that's something that worries me. So if I just wrap up here, I would say, point one, India, inevitably important to the United States. Point two, the United States is doing a lot. We intend to do a great deal more. But point three, there are reasons for concern, maybe even alarm, about the future of this relationship. Thank you.